Again, good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Trobert. I'm president of Kansas Policy Institute. On behalf of everyone at Kansas Policy Institute and our friends at the Show Me Institute, we want to welcome you to this evening. I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedules. I'm sure you're going to find this well worth your time. Kansas Policy Institute and the Show Me Institute both work very hard every day trying to protect the liberties and the freedoms that we have in this country. Sometimes it's easy to take those freedoms and liberties for granted. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Tom Palmer, can really put that in perspective. His work is devoted to bringing freedom to people who have none. And it is, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our chairman and founding member of Kansas Policy Institute, Mr. George Pearson, who will introduce our speaker tonight. George?
Dave, did you leave your equipment up here? No. Okay. By the time that the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, Tom Palmer was a seasoned freedom fighter. He had been arranging translations, smuggling books, smuggling money, smuggling copying machines into the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain. And he led study groups in Russia and Eastern Europe. So the wall's down, what's he do now? With degrees from St. John's College, Catholic University, and ultimately a doctorate in politics from Oxford University, Tom is also a scholar and was well prepared to teach others about freedom. He established Cato University, which is still the education arm of the Cato Institute. But Tom wasn't satisfied. He wasn't content to limit himself to educating and promoting in the U.S. He was soon spending more and more time back in Eastern Europe, where people were discovering freedom and trying to separate from their communist heritage. His lectures in Eastern Europe expanded into the Middle East at first, then into China, then into Africa, then into South America, Central Asia, South Asia, and everywhere that Tom went, he left in his wake a string of individuals and nascent organizations hungry for freedom. His international involvement led to a position at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, where he's executive vice president of international programs. At Atlas, Tom has colleagues. He and his colleagues have established operating programs in 14 different languages and managed programs for a whole worldwide network of think tanks. Atlas works to develop and nurture think tanks. Tom works to educate and inspire freedom-minded individuals. It's a nice combination. Today, Tom and Atlas work with over 400 think tanks worldwide, many achieving success that's above all odds. Whether he's in the United States or abroad, freedom is at the heart of Tom's activism and his educational efforts. He understands and can explain the subject like few others. He has many ways to talk about freedom. Tonight, his vehicle for talking about freedom is his moral defense of capitalism. As you will see, whatever vehicle Tom chooses, he will reflect his passion for freedom. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Tom Palmer.
George? Thank you kindly. Is this a little bit loud? I'll try to liberate myself from the podium. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been on the road a lot recently in the last couple of weeks in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Brazil, Morocco, Colorado, Norway, and Finland. So I flew back from Finland Saturday night, and it's nice to be someplace a little exotic for a change in Kansas City. I want to talk a little bit about the morality of capitalism. That's what I've been promoting for some time now, and to give you a little bit of background first. And that is, I have a pretty interesting job. I was once asked by a donor to the Cato Institute years ago at a donor event. He said, "Tom, what would you do if you didn't have to work to pay the rent and buy cat food and that sort of thing?" And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, "I would do what I do now, but don't tell my boss." I have a pretty fortunate job. It takes me to lots of different parts of the world. Just a few pictures recently. It's hard to see there, but that was in Nepal, the Samriddhi Foundation, our colleagues there. These are really wonderful young people. And if we think sometimes we have a hard time of it, their parliament is 2/3 communist, and the biggest bloc are Maoists. And they are standing up for our principles under those circumstances. This was in University of Warsaw, Warsaw School of Economics, rather, with Leszek Balcerowicz, the head of our partner there, the FOR, the Civic Development Foundation. This was at University of Łódź, where the Tocqueville Institute is our partner there in Poland. This is in the Hindu Kush, driving from Mazar-e Sharif to Kabul after some programs we had there. Professor Ramizpour and Mrs. Akhrari, the two on my right and left, are the founders of the Afghanistan Economic and Legal Studies Organization, which is a wonderful group promoting free markets, individual rights, and limited government in Afghanistan under very difficult circumstances. I'm the one in the middle there. That was in Nigeria at Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, which is the largest university in Nigeria, where we had a big program with the Students for Liberty chapter there. If you've never heard of Students for Liberty, it's a great organization. I'm so happy to be one of their advisors. And they're expanding internationally, not just in the United States and Canada. That was in Indonesia, the program we did there. This was Moscow. That was in Afghanistan, in Herat at the university, which is right on the Iranian border, where we have also some very, very good friends promoting our values and our principles. I'm the one in the middle again. That's in Nigeria at Lagos State University, where we had a big chapter of the Students for Liberty. That was in Tahrir Square in Egypt during the major rallies and demonstrations there, where we had a number of very good people on the podium. You can't see very well, but there are two people keeping their eye on me. The man with the big beard is what they call a Salafist, and so he was making sure I was not going to cause trouble. This was in India, where we had our free market caravan there recently. I was in Pakistan just before that and debated the case of free trade, caused very dear to my heart for a number of reasons. There was no trade between India and Pakistan. It was shut down. And I made the case, if you do not open trade with India, you will have war for hundreds of years. Trade is the greatest instrument of peace between nations. And I was so happy just very recently the Prime Minister of Pakistan, I take no credit for this, announced they were reopening trade, would now be allowed with India again, which is, I think, very, very exciting development. It was in Peking University. This was in North Korea, where we have a new frontier for our movement. I visited Pyongyang and Panmunjom from the northern side. And that was me just a few weeks ago in Afghanistan. I dress in local clothes because I have a strong aversion to beheading, and this helps me to interact. It also helps, I look like a Panjshiri or a Nuristani. And Afghanistan is ethnically very heterogeneous country. There's not one look. There are lots and lots of people who look different in the country, and fortunately for me, Nuristanis are considered the most brutal and tough people in the country. So long as I don't speak, people don't mess with me. Now, this raises the question, I wonder if it's possible to dim the lights a little bit. I think it's hard to see this. Of why. I've been doing this for a long time. It's in my blood in a way. I like being in difficult places. Lots of my friends like being in comfortable places, and I just don't. So this is a good job for me. I came across some old photos recently when I was going through a box from the early 1980s, and that was from the western side of the Berlin Wall. And I'll skip over this one quickly. This was a picture I took of me expressing my opinion of communism, so we'll slip over that quickly. It was a youthful, exuberant indiscretion. In 1989, I was privileged. I had moved to Austria and was privileged to be there during the uprising and the revolution in Czechoslovakia, and was very involved with this with our friends there. This was in the center of the square where the students had taken over and expelled all the professors from the university. No communists were allowed to teach at the university. So I was there for 2 weeks, and this is why. It's a photo I took on the Berlin Wall. I'll translate. Heinz Sokolowski, 48 years old, East Berlin, date of death 25th of November 1965. After 7 years imprisonment in the German Democratic Republic, shot while fleeing. That's what communism was. It's really what it amounted to. It wasn't just some kind of a social system. It's a system in which they killed you if you tried to leave, and the reason was you were state property. And an old friend of mine spent 4 years in prison in the so-called German Democratic Republic, and the charge was theft of state property. He tried to leave the country, and their argument was, we educated you and you are stealing state assets. Once you reach retirement age, they would let you leave, because then they didn't have to pay you a pension. They had used you up, and you could go out to the West and try to survive if you had family in West Germany or got a West German pension. But you were the property of the state, and I found this repulsive in the extreme. The reason why we've been involved in this effort is to advance liberty, and now here's the case I'm going to make. There's only one institutional arrangement that allows human beings to flourish and to recognize their dignity and rights, and that is free market capitalism. And that's the case that I've been making recently around the world. So the first question, what's capitalism? It's a good place to begin a conversation. And just a couple of quick notes here. Joseph Schumpeter, the name is a bit hard to read in this lighting, famous economist, in my opinion, too little appreciated. He was misunderstood by many friends of capitalism. He thought capitalism would be swept away and socialism would triumph. But not because he was a socialist. It's because he was really depressed. He thought that the socialists were going to win. And he thought socialism, in a sense, was inevitable. And he was very upset about that. He describes it as the subspecies of all the systems characterized by private property, carrying out new combinations of factors of production, and involving the creation of credit. So the key is, property is necessary but not sufficient. There are lots of systems of property around the world, but they don't turn into free market capitalism. The focus is on new combinations, innovation and change, and then of course modern institutions of credit. Joyce Appleby, who's a professor of history at UCLA, has a very interesting book. I enjoyed it tremendously, The Relentless Revolution, A History of Capitalism, and she focuses on private initiative as the key element there. Deirdre McCloskey, an economic historian, she has a great book which I really recommend. It's a good read also. It's volume 2 of 6 volumes, but you can read it alone. It's called Bourgeois Dignity. It's a wonderful book. She is a very fine historian, she's a very good economist, and this is what makes it unique, she writes English very well. You will not find any other person who satisfies all 3 criteria. She talks about private property and free labor without central planning, regulated by the rule of law, by ethical consensus. And she refers to the modern age as the age of innovation. I'll show why that's important in a moment. So capitalism is an economic system. We're accustomed to thinking about it in those terms, but it's more. It's also a legal system, and this is something we understand now better than we did in the past. I'll give you an example of why that is. When Milton Friedman gave advice to the collapsing Soviet Union, I was in Moscow. The Cato Institute held the first 2 conferences in the Soviet Union as it was collapsing in 1990 and 1991. I traveled there many times from Vienna to make the arrangements. And I remember that we had the first conference, and I had great fun with our foreign participants from Denmark, United States. I said, how old do you think this conference facility is? Everything was broken. The stairs were all crumbly. You put your hand on the railing and it fell off. The translation equipment was just a handful of wires you pulled out of the chair. So I said, how old do you think this place is? And most of them would say, ooh, 40 years maybe 50. I say, oh, it was just completed. This is the first event ever held in it. The Soviets had pioneered the concept of pre-broken stuff. Everything was already broken, so you didn't have to do it on your own. And Milton Friedman made a presentation, not in person, but he sent a message, and he said there are 3 things you should do in the Soviet Union as it was collapsing. And by the way, it was a real collapse. I remember when you'd get off a plane in the Soviet Union, the door would open, the first words out of the mouths of the airline attendants was, do you have bread? The mighty socialist empire, do you have bread? He said the 3 things to do are privatize, privatize, and privatize. It sounds sort of clever and insightful. But some years later, another conference in 2004, he made a videotape presentation, and he was a very humble person also, not merely brilliant, but humble. And he said, my advice was not such good advice. Privatize into what? You had no legal system. This is something that we didn't really appreciate, as at the time there was no law in the Soviet Union. No contract law or property law, normal rules that govern our behavior. They had a system of punishing people. They gave orders and they issued punishments. That's not law. That's orders. Law is about people coordinating their behavior, knowing what's expected of me and what I can expect of you, what we're allowed to do, what constitutes a valid contract. They didn't have any of that. You have to have that. What the late chairman of the Cato Institute, William Niskanen, called the soft infrastructure of the free society. The part you can't touch. The rules and expectations and norms, the legal system, trained judges, lawyers. They had virtually none of that. So that is very important, the legal foundation of free market capitalism. But in addition, one more thing. It's a cultural and social system. Relentless innovation. If you think about it, if you read Karl Marx's Critiques of Capitalism, one of the things he hates the most is the change, constant change. As he said, all that is solid melts into air. There's constant, ongoing change. It rests, you have this very dynamic society, but it has to rest on a stable set of rules that are not dynamic. They don't change. The rights of individuals, your fundamental rights, and the legal rules need to be stable. Legally secure rights, and I mentioned there, careers open to talent. An old 18th and 19th century phrase that today doesn't make much sense, but the idea in the old days was your life was determined by your birth. You're an aristocrat, you're in the royal family, you're a serf, you're a slave, you're a master. That's what you're going to be. You're born into that. But the idea of opening up the society to everyone being able to make an attempt. Thomas Paine put that very nicely when he talked about the nobility. He said nobility is just a short way of saying no ability. Right? These are people who just inherited their power and their position but had not done anything, had not accomplished anything. This new world of free market capitalism was a world in which you could accomplish things. You could try, no matter who you were, whatever humble background, religious background. You may be from an ethnic or religious or linguistic minority, but you had the right to make an attempt. It's a system of innovation that is decentralized, and this is another point that's very significant. Not just innovation as such, but innovation happening all around us. There's no ministry of innovation. You can imagine what a horror that would be, the Department of Innovation. It's happening every place. So we think about Apple computer, my gorgeous, fantastic MacBook Pro that I schlep every place. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak puttering around in the garage with electronic components. That's a high-profile image. But it's not just that. It's happening all around us all the time. One businessman I know started out, not a college-educated guy, he worked on the factory floor. And he mixed paint, as anyone who's ever gone through house repainting knows, getting exactly the right shade of eggshell or bone or something is very difficult to match. That's a very important part of the paint business. He did that, and he watched, and over time he said, look at all these extra steps you could eliminate. And he came up with a device, a little machine that could mix paint so it was always the same color. He went, sat down with an engineer, made it, manufactured it. Actually, the first ones he put together himself and sold them. And now he has manufacturing plants in the United States, Mexico, and Taiwan, and elsewhere. A very wealthy, successful person, making something I've never bought, right? A paint mixing device. But the way that we know which innovations are useful is a process of trial and error. Now, we will hear, as the election comes up, the same idiotic mantra Americans hear every 4 years. Where are the new ideas? I think it's one of the dumbest things people could possibly say. I like ideas that work, and whether they're new or old is of no interest to me. Like, for instance, I like arithmetic a lot. I use it every day. And every day, 7 and 5 is 12. It's not 75 or some new postmodern number. It's always 12. That's a very old idea, works very efficiently. Most new ideas are failures. They're stupid. We need a way to find the ones that work or add value and separate them out from the ones that don't. But we have that in the market economy under capitalism. It's called profit and loss. If you come up with a new idea, some way to mix paint better that saves a lot of wasted effort, you can make a profit, which means you took something with an opportunity cost of $100, that's what you could have gotten with it elsewhere, you mixed it, and then you could sell it for $106. That $6 is a measure of value added. But actually, you added a lot more than the $6 because the purchasers also benefited from that. That's called consumer surplus. Profits are a sign you're adding value. Losses are also important. That's a negative profit. It means you subtracted value. You took something that you could have produced $100 of value. When you were done and sold it, you could sell it for $91. You wiped out $9 of value. And that's a very strong signal that says, don't do that anymore. And if you keep doing it long enough, you can't because you run out of money. So this is a very powerful restraint on dumb ideas, and it's an incentive to good ones. Most powerful filtering mechanism we know of. And through that you have to have free market exchange. The only way to make that filtering mechanism work. Now there's a moral foundation. I often get asked when I make these presentations, usually by certain kind of professors or intellectuals who say, capitalism, moral? Absolutely. Capitalism has a very important moral foundation. And this gentleman here has a very nice looking set of eyeglasses. I want them. Now there are two ways I can get them. One, I could just hit him really hard, beat him down, and take them from him. And I'm a lot meaner than I look. That's option number one. Option number two is I could respect him and say, I like those glasses so much, is there anything you would like in exchange for them? You might say, $600, my MacBook Pro, not on your life, and so on. I respect him. There's a very clear moral foundation to do that. And a radical idea, this one you got to hold on to your hats. It's a radical idea. A lot of people don't go this far, but I think it's worth upholding. Other people don't belong to us. Everybody has his or her own life to lead. And capitalism is about respecting the uniqueness of every human life. Everybody matters. There's no one put onto this earth who's here for my sake alone, to serve me, to be my slave, my property. Every human being has moral worth and value. That is the fundamental core of it. They're not here just to serve me. And with this, respect for property. And this is a concept worth talking about in a moment, for a moment. Property in your person, property in your freedom, and then property in your estate. I'll talk a little bit more about this puzzling use of the term property in. To be efficient, and property in one's estate, this is estate, it's stuff, if you want to put it into contemporary English. It's property in your stuff. There are 3 Ds that are important. And one thing you find when you go to poor countries around the world, governments fail to do this fundamental job. There's very little market failure in the world, but the world is full of government failure, where governments fail to allow markets to develop. Number 1, property should be definable. I need to know what's yours and what's mine. Go to poor countries and you find lack of defined property rights, which means people spend a lot of effort fighting each other rather than trading and cooperating with each other over water, over land, over whatever it might happen to be. I was in Bangladesh recently with a businessman who's very supportive of our ideas there, and he said, well, we're developing this, and he has a brick factory, and we want to build more kilns here, but as soon as we announced it, we got a dozen lawsuits from people claiming they were the legitimate owners. Right? And each one you have to fight off or pay off. The legal system is very unclear. This is unlikely to happen here in Kansas. You go down to the county registrar's office, we see who's a legitimate owner, we do a title search, it's clear, not in Bangladesh. So he's spending years fighting off these cases. And in some cases it's worse. They come up with AK-47s instead, rather than legal papers. They should be defendable. And that takes many different forms, the ability to defend your property. We usually think of the police, but actually we have many ways of defending property. So if someone were to come up and attempt to take my Hugo Boss suit, I like very much, I would not call the police. This would be pointless. I would call on my own personal defense assistant, which is Mr. Fist, and Mr. Fist will defend my property claim in my suit very efficiently. So people don't do that to me. We defend our property through keys and locks. When you go to your car, you have an ignition key. It's unique to you. You invested money in defending your property. Right? It's a purely private arrangement to defend your rights. It doesn't rely on government. I once was in one place where people did not use keys for their vehicles, motorbikes. It was in Switzerland, in Ticino. And I noticed people had motorbikes with just on and off buttons. It's cheaper, so they saved all that ignition key expense. And it told me something. There are no thieves in those Swiss villages. Or maybe there were at one point and bad things happened to them. But I wouldn't do that in New York or Kansas City or Paris or lots of other places. So we defend in all kinds of ways, but then for more complex kinds of property, like shares in a firm, some kind of partnership arrangement, or the right to be paid a stream of payments for a loan that you made. For that, we need courts of law, and we need objective mechanisms for adjudicating disputes and enforcing them. And then finally, divestible. That's an old-fashioned English word. I divest myself of something. It means transferable. But as you're all aware, if we use transferable, we'd have DDT, and that is illegal under an international treaty. So we use DDD. It should be fairly easy to transfer resources. The legal system should facilitate mutually beneficial exchanges at low cost. Again, poor countries, this does not happen. It's extremely costly to make legal exchanges. The government does not facilitate them, they make it difficult. So a very simple example in Guatemala, where I teach occasionally, I learned to make a will, you have to have a lawyer. You have to. It's not a will without a lawyer. And they will produce a big document covered with stamps and seals and ribbons. It looks like a Habsburg state treaty of the 18th century, very elaborate. But it's expensive. And we, of course, know who's behind this requirement, the lawyers. They have a legal a corner on the market, an oligopoly, limited number of providers. They force you to do that, which means you might have to spend $100 on drafting up a will. And if you're a poor person, your whole estate is $1,500. Imagine that share going just to drafting up a will. So only rich people have wills. And poor people fight over the estate, or the grandkids squabbling and so on. Here in this country, you want to make a will? Go to the stationery shop. Buy a last will and testament. Fill it out. And to my good-for-nothing nephew, I leave such and so on. Get 3 adult primates to witness you signing it. They say, yes, I saw you, they sign it. That's a legal will. And that can go through probate, any court in the United States. Or go to willmaker.com and spend $29.95. It's easy. Very low cost. That's one of the differences between Guatemala and the United States. Is our legal system, bad as it is much lower cost and more efficient than theirs. And its corollaries, equality before the law and the presumption of liberty. That is to say, the presumption, which is very important, which we are in danger of losing. It is presumed you have the freedom to do anything you want, unless there's a reason that can be shown why you should be stopped. A good reason being you'll harm another person, for example. As opposed to the presumption of power, which is, it is presumed the state can order you to do anything you want, unless you can show a reason why they shouldn't. That's the socialist perspective. But the classical liberal, I hope everyone knows when I say liberal, I don't mean the political thought of Joe Biden, but the way the term was used in the past and is used in almost every other country in the world. I mean, limited government, free markets, respect for individual rights, and so on. There's a presumption of liberty. The burden of proof is on the person who stops you, not on you to justify your behavior, just as the burden of proof to prove guilt is on the prosecutor. You do not have to prove that you are innocent. And the rule of law. That little phrase means so much, and it turns out very difficult sometimes to translate into other languages. It means that when you go before the court, there's 2 questions that will be asked. What is the law, and what are the facts? And that's it. What is your religion? What tribe are you from? What language do you speak? What relationship are you to the Minister of Justice? All those questions are not to be considered by the court. And that's an accomplishment that's actually quite difficult to achieve and easy to lose. A little bit about property as to what it is. This is a really interesting word in the English language. It's related to the noun proper, that which is proper to a person. And it means not just stuff, but a deeper concept. In contemporary English, and this is the way in which English has lost its legal sophistication, we say, this is my property. For John Locke and James Madison and others, that would have been a nonsensical thing to say. Property means a right. How can this thing be my right? I have a right with regard to this object, to use it, to click through my presentation on it, to sell it, to loan it out, and so on. So property means your life. You have a property in your life. You have a property in your freedom. And you have a property in your estate, your stuff. But to capture that older meaning, which is so rich in law, we now use the term property rights. It's a redundant phrase. Locke would have torn his hair out if you said property rights, because it means rights. It's redundant. You're just repeating yourself. The reason why we do that is this older understanding of property understood that there can be a bundle of rights governing a resource, like take land. So a number of you are in real estate development. You know that you own the land, but your neighbor may have various rights with regard to it. To determine the height of your building, there may be an easement. Someone may have access to the water across it, subsurface mineral rights, all those complex sets of rights, and we can rearrange the bundles through mutually beneficial exchange. But if you just say, I own it, we miss all of that legal sophistication of what markets and rights are about. People rearranging their sets of rights in ways that are beneficial to both of the parties. And property in captures that. To try and bring it back into contemporary English, we use this ugly phrase, property rights, which understands maybe a multitude of rights over some asset, building a house, whatever it might happen to be. But it's more than just well-defined, legally secure and transferable property rights. And here's the cultural element that many people don't appreciate. There's a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation and a culture of adding value. So we think about entrepreneurship. Two of the great theorists of entrepreneurship, Richard Cantillon, great Irish banker from the 17th century, and Israel Kirzner, still very much alive and with us at New York University. Cantillon defined the entrepreneur as the one who bought at a fixed price and then sold at an uncertain price. That's entrepreneurship in his understanding. That is to say, entrepreneurs bear risk in the market economy. Kirzner talked about alertness to unperceived opportunities. The entrepreneur is the one who sees that you can have this, and if you were to combine them, you'd get some new product that was more valuable. You'd be adding value in doing that. The entrepreneur is looking for profit opportunities. There's another approach, and I think those are useful, Schumpeter's approach of what he calls creative destruction. The entrepreneur is creative, and creative in such a way that there's also destruction going on. This is what, again, many people don't like about capitalism. So he put it, the problem that is usually visualized is how capitalism administers existing structures. The relevant problem is how it creates and destroys them. So the example I like to give for college students is when I was a boy, there was a career that you trained for and aspired to. Typewriter repairman. Right? And you got to wear this cool uniform, and they had companies, they'd send them to your office. There were typewriter repair shops in every town, right? You kids don't remember this, but I'll just take my word for it. That's how the world was. And on all college campuses, there were little notes tacked to the board saying, I will type your college papers. You pay someone to make it beautiful and not all ugly and marked out with handwriting like my papers were. All those jobs are gone, wiped out. The victims of the cruelty of capitalism. Right? No more typewriter repairmen. And if you listen to the socialists, you'd imagine that they just died. They staggered out of their typewriter repair shops and expired. Of course, that didn't happen. They did other things. All those typewriter factories, they're all closed. I don't know if anyone really makes typewriters anymore. A good friend of mine, whose son, when he was 5, said that little Thomas came in and said, Daddy, come look at this. There's a computer with no monitor. He could not imagine what it was. I was telling this story to a friend recently in Finland, and he said, my son showed me the first typewriter he'd seen when someone showed how it worked. He said, Daddy, this prints in real time. So it was a new understanding of the typewriter. Well, all those are gone. Lots of industries, they pass away. As Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. But it's replaced by something better, something that can do more. My typewriter wouldn't allow me to watch movies, have Skype conversations with people on other continents, listen to music, store endless irritating email messages from people, right? But my replacement for the typewriter can do so much more. So this constant creative destruction that many people do find unsettling. Now, a little bit of a digression. We are told because of the financial crisis that capitalism has failed. It will be replaced by something never yet tried called socialism, which will work. And we've seen a lot of people arguing this, pages in the New York Times, and the so-called Occupy Wall Street movement. But let's think about that. When I think of the institutions I associate with the financial crisis, we can ask, are those institutions of free market capitalism or something else instead? The first one that comes to mind is the Federal Reserve System. And I don't think of the Federal Reserve System as an institution of free market capitalism. If you look at the policies that they had instituted of real negative interest rates, 2004 to 2006, if you take the nominal rate and then the expected inflation rate, the real interest rates they were offering were negative. And we found out when you offer people a negative interest rate, in effect you're paying them to borrow. We can ask how much will they borrow? And we found out. The answer is a lot. They will borrow a lot of money. So we ended up with staggering amounts of borrowing, credit pouring into the market, and then deliberate policy initiated first under the Clinton administration and then accelerated under the Bush administration. No party has clean hands in this regard. Freddie Mac, Federal National Mortgage Corporation, as you say, we make home possible. Without them, home would be impossible. And Fannie Mae, Federal National Mortgage Association, they pushed huge amounts of credit into the housing sector. And the language is really astonishing. They explicitly talked about creative financing and changing lending standards to make housing more affordable to previously unqualified buyers. As they say, hello, there's going to be problems with this. Federal Housing Administration, if you know how they operate, giving guarantees for home loans. For about 60 years, there was a 20% down payment required. I have to explain this to young people, college students, what that means. It meant you bought a $100,000 house, the bank would allow you to borrow $80,000 if you matched it with $20,000 from what used to be called, I asked them to write this down, savings. And savings was when you earned $100, spent $94, the $6 was called savings, very archaic concept. That was lowered from 20% to 3%. And since when you stop paying your mortgage, you lose your down payment, the penalty went from $20,000 to $3,000. We could ask, are people more or less likely to default on their mortgages now that you've reduced the penalty by $17,000? And fortunately, 2008, greatest innovation in the history of home finance, the FHA federally guaranteed 0% down payment mortgage, right, just as the crisis was beginning, which meant if you walk away from your mortgage, you lose nothing. And big surprise, people began to default on their mortgages. And finally, the Bank for International Settlements, which administers the Basel Accords, which govern international financial institutions. These were developed to guarantee the stability of the world financial system. It was a huge success, as shown by the fact we got the biggest financial crisis since 1929, after the Basel Accords had been put into place. What they did was, they said, we'll make sure banks are properly run, that they have sufficient capital reserves. There's a capital requirement that they established, that they can meet all of their obligations. But we, the regulators, are so smart, we'll tell them the risk of all the different assets they may hold, which will determine the capital requirements held against them. Lower is better for banks, because they like to loan that extra money out and earn interest on it. So they said the least risky is a zero risk category of assets called sovereign debt. If you have sovereign debt, you have zero capital requirement. So we can translate sovereign debt into today's headlines. Greek government bonds, than which a more risky investment has never been invented, right, is the Greek government bond. Next, least risky category that had only a 25% requirement compared to the possible total was government guaranteed mortgage-backed securities, which are made up of all those non-performing home mortgages. And surprise, you got a global financial meltdown as a consequence. But whatever we might say about this, this is not free market capitalism. These are institutions of government, institutions of the state deliberately intervening to distort the market process, and we got a disaster as a consequence. We also got one intervention on top of another one. So you take General Motors here, they had made a little mistake. They decided instead of making cars, they would become a financing company. And they forgot to make cars anyone actually wanted to drive. So they had big inventories of unsellable cars and then found themselves in the middle of a financial crisis. They should have gone bankrupt. That's the way this is supposed to happen, which means the shareholders' value would drop to zero. They suspended trading in GM shares. They were worth nothing. That tells you something about the management of the company. The bondholders should have had the right to come in and reorganize the company. But that was not allowed. And instead, it was effectively nationalized. They purchased the shares with taxpayer money and instituted a new organization to replace it, the new GM, Government Motors. We're looking forward now to the first automobile designed by White House lawyers. I cannot wait to drive this vehicle. And cronyism, rewarding political supporters. And what we saw in this case was the labor unions. Got a great deal out of this. And when they've been closing factories, it's the non-union shops are closed with the condition that they may not reapply for General Motors employment anyplace else. Pure venal punishment and support for the labor unions. Solyndra is another good example of this. If you've read any of the emails that came out of the White House, you've got to support this government guaranteed loan because we need to have it approved before the vice president appears to speak at their factory. It was simply grotesque. And the use of the taxpayers' funds for purely political purposes. Now, this is a feature of interventionism. And one thing I found, I went and talked to some of the Occupy Wall Street movement people in New York, and I speak on college campuses all the time. And when I run into people who say, we hate capitalism and we're in favor of something else, I ask them, when I can find the ones who are coherent, and there are some of them, I'll say, what is it you're angry about? And what I find systematically is what makes them angry is the bailouts, the subsidies, the insider deals between politicians and business people, cronyism. And that makes me angry too. It's what made the Tea Party angry. It's not right. It's unfair. And when the solution, this is where the Occupy Wall Street people I think have got it wrong, they think the solution is more interventionism. And I tried to explain that will just get more cronyism. Right? The solution to cronyism is free markets instead. I want to share just a little video on this topic from one of our Russian colleagues, one of our Russian partners, and it's got subtitles. English is a bit accented. This is not playing. Well, for some reason, the voice isn't coming through. Can you read his statement? I'll put it back a little bit and play it again then. People in our country and our region suffered so long from a lack of capitalism as the rest of the world benefited from it. We suffered from limitations of slavery while others benefited from freedom and rights. What you have now in Russia is an improvement, sure, over the horrors of socialism, but it is less free market capitalism than cronyism. The system of power and privileges. Free market capitalism means full equality before the law and no privileges for anyone. Free market capitalism is the key not only to widespread prosperity and social progress, but to human dignity. Capitalism is the only economic system suited to the dignity of the human being. Economic logic requires free market capitalism. Yep, it is so. But even more so, it is required by morality. He's a professor of philosophy in Siberia and is making this case for free market capitalism as a solution to Russia's problems. A little discourse on language, and then I'll turn to some data and then wrap up. Think about the way our language is poisoned against capitalism. We need a kind of a cultural renewal and people paying attention to these matters. Take the term competition. In English, what words flow off the tongue? Dog eat dog and cutthroat. They're just natural. They're in the air. But think about what they mean. Cutthroat refers to, imagine someone, if you would, walking up behind me, grabbing my head with a razor blade, slashing my throat, severing the carotid artery, and spraying the front row with arterial blood, after which I die. It's a very violent image. And think about dog eat dog. Imagine a poodle eating a chihuahua. It's a horrible, brutal image, right? But what is competition in the market economy? Firms compete in order to cooperate. It's a form of cooperation. It's not the opposite to cooperation. It's the context that makes a cooperative society possible. Apple and Dell are competing, they're computing as well, competing for my business. Restaurants compete for my business. Airlines compete for my business. Clothing stores compete for my business because they want to cooperate with me, not because they're uncooperative people. Exchange, we're told it's selfish and greedy. People just want the lowest price or the highest price if they're the seller. But what is exchange about? It's mutually beneficial. I'll tell a little story also from Guatemala about that. This message became more than theoretical to me. I understood it better when a friend offered me a great trip. He's a professor of economic anthropology at the University of Francisco Marroquin. And he's a Mayan, so he speaks Spanish and English, but his own language and culture are Mayan. And he said, I'm going to go up on the weekend to visit my mother in the Mayan highlands. Would you like to come with? I said, sure. Sounded like a great trip. And it was. I got to see all kinds of things people don't normally get to see. And one of the things that we did was to go to the market in Chichicastenango, and I bought all kinds of cool stuff. And I turned to him once. He was translating for me because the merchants there don't speak Spanish. And I said, you know, Estuardo, I feel bad now. I feel guilty and bad. He said, why? He said, I've been bargaining with this merchant, and I realized in quetzales, translate into dollars, it was less than $1 that I've been haggling over. And to me, that's not much money. But to this guy, that's a fair amount of money for him. That's a big portion of his daily income. And Estuardo said, Tom, sit down. Sit down. He put his hand on my forehead. He said, you're sick. What do you mean? He said, you have a socialist virus. You think we Indian people are stupid, like all the socialists think. They all think we're stupid, and that we let white people come and cheat us, and that we like selling stuff at a loss to Anglos. He said, let me explain something. If an indigenous merchant says yes, that merchant made money. If they say no, no is no. If they say yes, they made money. And judging by your bargaining skills, quite a handsome profit as well. So it was very clear there. He wanted to make it clear, when you say yes, you made a profit. John Stossel puts it nicely. He talks about the double thank you. Isn't it strange? If you hold open the door for another person, that person says thank you. You wouldn't say thank you. That would be weird. When you go into the store, you buy something, the merchant says thank you, and you say thank you. Both of you benefited from that. Both of you say thank you. That's the market. That's capitalism, is a double thank you. And finally, profit. Obscene profits, windfall profits. A phrase like justified profit is artificial. It doesn't come off the tongue. It's not part of our cultural, the tools in the air for us. But profit is a sign, a measure of value added. A profit honestly earned is a reason to be proud of what one accomplished. It means you added value to the world. You didn't cheat anybody. Now you can cheat people and earn profits. Thieves spend $8 on a knife, stab me, gets $20, $12 profit, right, in some sense, by violating my rights. But if it's a voluntary exchange, which the thief is not engaging in, the person who earns the profit has every reason to be proud of that accomplishment. So let's look at a little bit of data on what free market capitalism has achieved. And here's one that is a little shocking to people. Angus Madison studied per capita income around the world from the year 1 until the present, and you'll notice it's pretty flat for a long time. It doesn't change very much. It goes up a little bit during what's called the High Middle Ages in Europe and the Southern Sung Dynasty in China. This period here collapses during what's called the general crisis of the 17th century. Think about the Mongol wars in northern China, but then also the 30 Years' War in Europe between 1618 and 1648. It's totally devastating. And then recovers, and around 1800, just a little bit before, in Great Britain and the British North American colonies, look at what happens. This is the modern world that we live in. Deirdre McCloskey calls this the great fact. This is what has to be explained. What made that possible? What was it about the world that unleashed this incredible creative energy? So if you think about it in concrete terms, we could imagine arranging a visit. Julius Caesar, who dies right about here, is invited to have dinner with George Washington, right about here. He would find the world very recognizable. Messages handwritten and sent. He travels on the ocean by wind power or human labor, travels on a horse. They have dinner by candlelight, and it's served by slaves. This world is largely intelligible to him. Now move forward just a little bit. The messages sent by telegraph almost instantaneously around the world. He travels on a steamship, travels in a train. A little bit further on, there's no slaves. All the people who cook the food are free, voluntary workers are being paid for their service. Then they have it by electric light. Then he flies there on an airplane, a giant metal tube hurtling through the air. And today, he would send a tweet, and they'd have dinner by Skype. Right? Our world is unintelligible to him. He would find it completely foreign. The world has changed so much because of free market capitalism. Now, let's look at measuring the effects of free market capitalism worldwide. One of our partners in Canada, the Fraser Institute, has a major project, been going on for 30 years, Economic Freedom of the World Report. There's a really valuable data sources, and it's a very transparent project. freetheworld.com has all the data sets, all the studies. They invite people to come and play with them and see if they can disprove their claims, come up with new ways to compare them, and so on. They measure countries by degree of economic freedom, or free market capitalism. And then a very simple set of comparisons. We find free market capitalism is robustly, positively correlated with per capita income. Now, correlation and causation are different things. Maybe countries become really rich and then say, what the heck, let's try free market capitalism. But that's easy to test for. That does not happen. Poor countries adopt good economic policies and become wealthy. We can look at one of the interesting outcomes of their study. This was a really unexpected. We hear it said, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, free market capitalism leads to more inequality. I said, is it true? So they took the poorest 10% of the population and then looked at their share of total national income. What they found was it is invariant to economic policy. It's about 2.5%. That was really interesting and rather surprising. And it's a result that has stood the test of time over and over. It's quite consistent. I don't know why it's about 2.5%, but it's consistent across all different economic and political systems. But here is what is not invariant to economic system. What is the income you actually earn? Or, to put it concretely, if you're going to be a poor person, it's much better to be poor in Switzerland than Swaziland. Right? The poor people in Switzerland don't have iPads. They don't have some cool stuff that their neighbors have. But the poor people in Swaziland see their children die of cholera and terrible diseases. They live short, miserable, terrible lives. That is the difference of free market capitalism. We can look at life expectancy, strongly correlated. This is a complex matter that deserves more study, but it's strongly correlated to income. So we can think about it as 20 more years of life. It's the gift of free market capitalism, the ability to see your grandchildren grow up and meet your great-grandchildren. That's what capitalism has made possible. Environmental performance is strongly correlated with free market capitalism. And this is for several reasons. One is wealthier countries consider an environment what is called a superior good. The richer you are, the more of it you'll buy, in effect. So when you're wealthy, you can afford to have a clean environment, take care of nature. Poor people are not as concerned about that. And then in addition, capitalism is connected to property rights. Property rights cause people to be more careful with what they have. We don't throw trash into our neighbor's living room because they own it. The more that's subject to private ownership, the less polluting behavior you're likely to see. Corruption, very robustly inversely correlated. Free market capitalist societies have much less corruption. It's not zero, sad to say. Even in Switzerland, there's undoubtedly one crooked policeman lurking in some little canton, but not that many. And this is a case, again, deserves a lot more careful study. What is it about free market capitalism that acts against corruption? But one thing is pretty intuitive. When bureaucrats have fewer opportunities where you have to go and ask them for permission, there's fewer chances to deny it, which means fewer opportunities to shake you down for money. The more you eliminate those powers, the less power they have to shake you down. Civil and political liberties are strongly correlated to free market capitalism. This is, again, a complex phenomenon. It's not a strict one-to-one correlation. There are statistical outliers. Take the case of Hong Kong. Very high on economic freedom, not really a free society. They're not politically free because they're governed from Beijing. And Singapore, another interesting statistical outlier. It's not the worst tyranny in the world, but it's not a free society. It's been correctly described as Disneyland plus the death penalty. But these are odd statistical outliers. We find a strong connection between free market capitalism and democratic, open society. And I'll conclude with something on peace. Eric Gartsky from Columbia University looked at these data, and he tested a very interesting thesis in political science called the democratic peace. Democracies tend not to wage war on other democracies. And people have asked, why is that? Is it because they have free press? They have public debate? What is the reason for that? And he noticed, well, democracies also tend to be free markets. So what is it that's doing the heavy lifting? And using statistical techniques, he tried to disentangle the two, and he found economic freedom was very robustly negatively correlated with military interstate disputes between states. So you can see a strong negative slope to the curve, and even the confidence intervals are negatively sloped. Then he separated out only the democratic component, trying to isolate that as a causal factor. And what he found was also a negative slope, but not nearly as negatively sloped, and the confidence intervals diverge. What this meant was, what's doing the heavy lifting is that democracies tend to be free market oriented, much more so than non-democracies. So he said it's the free trade element that seems to be the primary cause of peace. But democracy is a good thing, he's not questioning that. But he says it seems it's the free market element that is the main engine of peace. We should look at, and this is a deep point, I won't tarry on it, that exchange is not a zero-sum game. A lot of people think that if one country gets richer, others are getting poorer. Think about, if you know Lou Dobbs, who's the television commentator, entertainer as well. And Lou, I've debated him a couple of times, he's always upset when foreigners become wealthier. This is a bad thing. Canadians, Chinese, used to be the Japanese, he would get angry about. Because the view is if they're getting richer, I must be getting poorer. But that's not how free markets work. When your trading partner gets richer, and you trade with them freely, it's good for you. As their incomes rise, they can buy more of your stuff, they can pay more for your stuff. So Americans should be really happy whenever Canadians prosper. We have a little Happy Canada Day occasionally. They're the biggest purchasers of American goods and services in the world. That border has more goods and services flowing than any other in the world. And it's good for Americans if Canadians become wealthier. And it's good for Canadians if Americans become wealthier. They can pay more for your stuff. So I'll conclude with poetry. So we've had some economic theory, some data, a little bit of linguistics, some legal theory, and I think we should have poetry. That's part of the free society as well. A great poem, the Odyssey, by a poet named Homer. He has a TV show that's currently on American TV now. It's very popular. And he wrote earlier two important poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad is a poem basically aimed at the teenage male market. It's about fighting, war, and girls. It's a basic teenage boy poem. The Odyssey is a poem for adults. It's about Odysseus after the war going home to see his wife. He has not seen Penelope in so many years. And he's undergoing all these struggles to go home to be with his wife at home. And among the stories, he lands with a ship on the island of the Cyclops. And the Cyclops is not very nice. See, there he is being stabbed in the eye by Odysseus. He attacks Odysseus's crew and eats some of them, which is rude. And Odysseus berates him, and he says, "What is my guest gift?" And to understand in the Greek context what that means, it was traditional, if you wash up on the shores of my island, you are my guest, and I must give you gifts, water, clothing, food, until you're able to go on your way. And we can see why in social science that would happen. It's reciprocity. I might end up on your island someday, and I would hope the same. And indeed, in the Greek mythology, Zeus is called the god of strangers. If you're bad to a stranger and rob the stranger, Zeus will still see it and punish you. It's a society oriented towards hospitality towards strangers. So he says, "What is my guest gift?" And the Cyclops says, "I'll eat you last." Right? That's pretty bad. So Homer then asks, why is the Cyclops a savage? And the answer is really striking. The Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights there to build them good, strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. The Cyclops is a savage because he lives in the ideal world of the Occupy Wall Street movement. All the production and all the consumption is local. They don't live by trade. There are no merchants. There are no businesses. And the consequence is he's a savage. It's capitalism, it's trade and exchange that civilizes us and makes us to be fully human. And with that, I hope that we will be able to launch a campaign to realize the potential of human civilization and of American civilization, a country that was founded on the principle of respect for the rights of the individual, limitation on government power, respect for honest business endeavor, to be honored and not spit upon or disrespected in the way that our current government is doing, and that we can bring about a revival of free market capitalism. Thank you very much.